The Rebel Capitalist Show.
Just today, OPEC announced that they're going to make some cuts. I always listen to my good buddy Eric Townsend, who's an oil expert. He does macro voices. And he was saying on Twitter that that might not be a huge deal because they're already producing as before this. So this might just bring them down to the level where they're producing. It might just be kind of a more for optics. And if it is for optics, that's a pretty big middle finger to the Biden administration. So have you been following this? And if so, what's your view here?
A bit, it is pretty simple. I don't think we need to overcomplicate this. I asked Gary Kasparov one time when he spoke at my conference years ago, I said, well, what's Putin's strategy, or what's his grand strategy? And he said, this is from a grandmaster chess champion. He said, there is no grand strategy. His idea is to simply poke a stick in Uncle Sam's eye whenever and wherever he can to keep tensions high, to keep oil prices high. And I think that, Saudi is just pissed off at Biden. And this is their chance with the elections coming up to stick them in the eye. And that's what they're doing. And from what I've also heard, it's engendered panic in the White House. Because of this, they're afraid that oil prices and gas prices are going to surge right before the midterms. And if they're panicking, they're just bound to do something incredibly stupid.
Like ban exports. Did you read about that, Brien?
Which one?
Like banning exports?
Or the SPR and ramping that up and everything else. This like they sit around and say this. It's like an Animal House scene. This calls for somebody to do something incredibly stupid, and that us is us. And so they're going to overreact. They're going to do something that is going to make the situation worse. They have unintended consequences, et cetera, et cetera.
You have had the opportunity to rub elbows with some incredible people over the years, and from the macro space, I would assume from the kind of political sphere as well.
Yeah.
And I've always wondered this myself, because just for people who have a little bit of common sense, you can see how things like banning exports or, the SPR, or like with the EU trying to put a price cap on what they're willing to pay for Russian oil. It's just, it's blatantly stupid. And it's obvious that it won't work. And it's obvious that it'll actually do more harm than good. So what I've always wondered is, are these people just stupid, or are they naive? Are they ignorant? Or is there some other like Machiavellian ulterior motive? Because it doesn't seem like there can be a third option there.
Yeah, I'm a bit more charitable than most. I think a lot of them are just willfully ignorant. I say willfully because they don't want to educate themselves on it. They don't have any kind of world experience in these matters. They haven't had the influences that we have had, and they don't want to have those influences because they're very comfortable and cozy in their own little world. And what they're doing is by keeping themselves ignorant, they're keeping themselves in power, because I think power and influence drives it all. I've never personally understood those motivations or understood those people. They give me the heebie-jeebies just to be around them, but it's there, it's obvious. And to stay in power, they need to repeat and parrot back the same things that they've heard all their lives and stay within the club.
And maybe it's some cognitive dissonance as well, that if they've got this worldview, and if anything challenges that worldview, it's just psychologically very uncomfortable. Another thing that comes to mind is the UN coming out yesterday or the day prior and basically begging the central banks to stop raising interest rates. And they said, well, what you can do is stop raising rates, but then to combat inflation, you can just come out with price controls. Yeah. I'm like, what's funny is I kind of semi-predict, not the UN, but I thought we'd do that in the United States, where they'd stop raising rates, inflation would still run hot, and then we'd implement price controls like we did in the 1970s. But it seems like the UN is talking about that. And that's another example of something that if you just take 5 minutes to study economics, you see that will make matters worse. And all economists agree, whether it's Paul Krugman or
Yeah.
Thomas Sowell and everyone in between, that price controls are a bad idea, lead to shortages, and therefore higher prices in the future. So anyway, I just wanted to throw that out as another example.
Yeah, I would agree with that. That's something that probably the only thing that all economists agree on.
Yeah.
And you would think that they would have that much common sense, but beyond that, a lot of the free market ideals and views that we hold are so antithetical to everything that they've been raised in, that they've been raised in this elitism that the more educated, the more intelligent among us need to lead the masses who don't really know what what's for their own good. So when you come at them with these free market principles, it's 180 degrees from everything that they believe and were raised to, and it totally invalidates everything that they've worked for and with all their lives. So you're essentially saying to them, the world would have been better off if you were not born. And that's
or at least
hard
never went
thing
to
for people
college,
to
right?
accept. Yeah, that they're not going to take that, very easily.
Like we said earlier, you've been doing this a long time. I've only been doing this as far as studying macro since 2012. That's really when I retired and got into it. And at the time, I didn't know anything. Do you think this narrative, the one that you just described, that's very anti-free market capitalism, almost Marxism to a degree, and especially with the mainstream media parroting the same things and the kind of global elite, the politicians, has that gotten worse since you got in the game, or is it just kind of amplified now with social media?
Well, I think it definitely has gotten amplified, and even the smallest voice can be screaming, and social media get a lot of retweets and have a lot of perhaps undue influence. But I do think it's gotten worse because we've had another generation of at least of indoctrination in schools where Marxism is good, et cetera, et cetera. I remember back in the 1990s, early 1990s, there was such hope with the fall of the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc and the spread of free markets. And we just thought it was going to go spread across the world like a wildfire. And, in retrospect, we were obviously, far too naive and optimistic. And a lot of that, back then, it used to be commonly accepted that free markets were great, were good. Freedom was good. Personal liberty was good. And, a lot of that would be contested today.
Yeah, I'm hoping that's cyclical, because I've heard that's why Hayek wrote The Road to Serfdom, because he saw that narrative, the Marxist narrative, central planning narrative, gaining traction after World War II. I think the argument in the United States back then is, well, if we can use central planning to a degree to win a world war, why can't we use that same idea, the same concepts to manage an economy? And that was one of the things that drove him to write that book, is to offer like a counter narrative or a counter argument. And then I remember also Friedman at the end of the 60s or the beginning of the 70s, it might have been, where he was really struggling with the ideas he was trying to promote as far as being accepted in the mainstream. And it wasn't until the latter part of the 70s when we really started having an issue with inflation, and then maybe the 80s when he did Free to Choose, and then Reagan, I think, adopted a lot of his policies. The mainstream media became more receptive. So hopefully this is cyclical. Hopefully we're at peak insanity right now, and it's only going to get better.
Yeah,
I don't know.
That's an optimistic view, and that maybe we're progressing upward, but there's wiggles to the line. If you look at post World War I, the 1920s were a big growth of socialism, especially overseas in the UK, et cetera. And today, could you imagine somebody like Milton Friedman winning the Nobel Prize?
Yeah, exactly. Not even close.
Not a shot. So maybe we're going to have another sine wave or something, and we'll have keep an uptrend intact.
Yeah. Well, we're in a bubble and everything else, Brien. So why not socialist insanity?
Yeah, that's true. But when bubbles burst, they're often not replaced with the radicals rise, and that's when bad things can happen.